The message arrived in the middle of a workday, the kind of moment that quietly divides a life into before and after. One glance at my phone was all it took for the air to leave my lungs. My mother had chosen that day, that very hour, to tell me I should not come to my own sister's wedding because the family wanted everything to stay calm and drama-free. I stared at the screen in disbelief, not because I did not understand what she meant, but because I understood it too well. When I scrolled just slightly, numb and shaking, I saw the small but unmistakable digital confirmation beneath it. My sister had reacted in approval. In that instant, the years of silence, the careful restraint, the pretending that I still belonged, all collapsed into one suffocating truth. I was no longer considered family in the only place that ever claimed me. I grew up learning how to be smaller than the room, quieter than the table, and grateful for scraps of belonging. From the outside, our family looked solid and respectable, the kind that posed neatly for photos and spoke proudly of traditions. But on the inside, the unspoken order of who mattered more was stitched into every gathering. I was the only one who looked different, carried a different history in my skin, whose presence required explanation. My father had been the reason for that difference, a man my mother loved once, but never defended long enough. After he died, the house became a place where his memory was tolerated only as long as it stayed invisible through me. I learned quickly that my comfort was always negotiable if it meant preserving everyone else's peace. As we grew older, my sister leaned easily into the role that was given to her. She mirrored the expectations handed to her, and thrived in the approval that followed. I learned to survive by adapting, by becoming helpful, agreeable, impressive enough to earn temporary acceptance. I collected degrees and promotions like shields, hoping achievement would compensate for whatever they saw as lacking in me. But success never softened their eyes. It only made my difference more inconvenient. When the engagement was announced, the family erupted in celebration. Photos, planning, excitement poured through every conversation. I was included on the surface but excluded in ways subtle enough that protest would seem petty. I traveled across cities for fittings where no fabric was ever quite right for me. I offered help that was politely declined. I sat through planning meetings where traditions were discussed as though I were listening to someone else's heritage being preserved without me. Still I stayed. I told myself endurance was proof of love. Until the message arrived. The justification was carefully chosen. They wanted peace. They wanted harmony. They wanted to prevent discomfort on a day meant to be joyful. None of those words mentioned race, yet every one of them was shaped by it. I was the variable that introduced uncertainty. My presence was the risk factor. My absence was the solution. And my own sister, the person who shared my childhood bedroom and my secrets, silently agreed with that solution. Shame arrived before anger. I questioned myself the way they had taught me to do. I wondered if I had been too visible, too successful, too unwilling to fade quietly into the background. I replayed memories looking for the moment where I had made myself difficult. But another feeling began to rise beneath that self-doubt, slow and deliberate. It was the realization that I had spent my entire life trying to prove worthiness to people who benefited from never granting it. The days leading up to the wedding moved with surreal slowness. I was no longer involved in anything, not officially excluded yet fully erased. Relatives posted joyful updates that carefully avoided tagging me. My mother stopped calling altogether. The silence was not accidental. It was chosen. But something had shifted in me. For the first time, I stopped asking what I had done wrong and started asking why I was still offering loyalty to people who saw my dignity as optional. The story they had always told was that patience was my virtue, that understanding was my obligation. What they never expected was for me to finally understand what was being done to me. I did not confront them. I did not argue. I simply stepped back and let them proceed without me, just as they had requested. But in the quiet space that opened up, I began telling my story elsewhere. Not in anger, not with accusation, but with clarity. I spoke about growing up as the only one who never quite fit the photograph's frame. I spoke about how racism can live politely at the dinner table, never announcing itself, only shaping who is welcomed and who is tolerated. I spoke about the cost of being asked to disappear for the comfort of others. What I did not anticipate was how many people were waiting to hear that story. Messages began arriving from former classmates, co-workers, distant acquaintances. Some shared experiences that mirrored my own almost exactly. Others admitted they had once been part of families like mine, and had never confronted the damage it caused. The words I had swallowed for years were finding echoes in places I never expected. On the day of the wedding, I woke up early, not with grief as I had feared, but with a strange, steady calm. I imagined the ceremony unfolding without me, the photographs immaculate in their uniformity. And instead of pain, I felt release. The version of family I had been excluded from was the same one that had excluded parts of me my entire life. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A journalist I knew through community work reached out, asking if I would be willing to have my experience included in a feature about subtle forms of racial exclusion in modern families. I said yes without hesitating. My name would be public. My story would be visible. I would no longer shrink it for the comfort of people who had never shrunk their expectations of me. The article was published a week later. It was careful and factual, compassionate and unflinching. It described a woman who had been asked not to attend her own sister's wedding for the sake of peace that required her absence. It described how racism does not always announce itself in slurs and violence, but in decisions made quietly behind the language of harmony. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The piece was shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from across the world. Some praised the courage it took to speak. Others recognized their own families in the story, and felt discomfort they could no longer ignore. Organizations reached out. Panels invited me to speak. My experience, once silenced for fear of disruption, had become a catalyst for conversations they had spent decades avoiding. And then the messages from my family arrived. At first, they were careful, phrased in concern rather than accountability. They spoke of shock and confusion as though the events were mysterious rather than deliberate. My mother wrote that she never intended to hurt me, only to protect the day. My sister wrote that she had been overwhelmed, that it had all happened so fast, that she had felt pressured. None of those explanations addressed the core truth. They only attempted to soften it. What they could not undo was that the private decision to erase me had become a public mirror. Extended relatives who had quietly agreed with my exclusion were now forced to confront it in daylight. Friends who had once admired the family's unity began asking uncomfortable questions. The image they had protected so fiercely began to fracture. Not because I attacked it, but because it could not survive honesty. Months later, my mother finally visited me. She looked smaller than I remembered, worn down not by age, but by the realization that silence had a cost. She did not come with excuses this time. She came with the weight of consequences she could no longer deny. For the first time, she had been asked why one child was welcome and the other was not, and she had no answer that did not sound like the truth. Revenge is often imagined as something loud and destructive. But what happened instead was quieter and far more unforgiving. I did not punish them. I simply refused to carry their shame anymore. I chose visibility over obedience. I chose self-respect over borrowed belonging. And that choice altered the balance of power they had relied on my entire life. Today, my relationship with my family exists in a narrowed, honest space. There is no pretending that exclusion was kindness. There is no dressing racism in the language of peace. Some relationships did not survive that clarity. Others are rebuilding slowly, painfully, but truthfully. And some bridges were meant to fall so better structures could rise elsewhere. What changed most was me. I no longer wait for invitation to places where my dignity must be negotiated. I no longer translate my worth into terms that make others comfortable. The wedding I was told not to attend became the moment I finally attended myself. Sometimes I wonder if my sister thinks about the reaction she sent so casually, the small digital gesture that confirmed my exclusion. Sometimes I wonder if my mother replays the moment she chose family peace over my presence. But the truth is, their reflections are no longer my responsibility. My story does not exist to absolve them. It exists to free me and to remind anyone listening that silence is never neutral. And peace built on erasure is not peace at all. If a family can celebrate without you to avoid discomfort, then your absence was always part of their comfort. And the most powerful rebellion against that kind of injustice is not destruction, but truth spoken so clearly it can no longer be denied.